Yeah, well, I
Sure.
mean, conservatives are
Yeah.
always concerned with unintended consequences, right? And so they don't presume that hypothetically benevolent social policies are going to produce a positive result.
Sure, and I think there are social patterns that give reason for concern. So, for example, this idea of sexual promiscuity. I think the latest manifestation of this is polyamory. I had this conversation with a friend of mine, a couple of years ago. He told me, Rob, when I open up my Tinder app, this dating app, and I put the radius to just a couple of miles around. He also attends, a university. When I put it just to a couple of miles around, it's pretty much all of my matches. All of the other profiles I see are other women students at the university. And when I look at their bios, half of them say that they're polyamorous, or they're interested in an open relationship, or they're not looking for anything too serious. And then he told me, when he extended the radius to match with women outside of the university, into the town, which is sort of this working class town, he said that about half of the women that he saw on his app were single moms. And so, and it's the same age group, right? Like 18 to say 23 years old. So in the university, they're interested in having fun. And then the 18 to 23-year-old working class women are having a much different experience of life. And my claim is that the luxury beliefs of the former have basically trickled down and wreaked havoc among the latter. So starting in the 1960s, there's data from Robert Putnam and Charles Murray and others, which you may have seen, showing, for example, that in 1960, children born to working class families and children born to affluent families, 95% of them were born and raised by both of their birth parents. And if you fast forward from 1960 to 2005, the affluent families, the children of the affluent, had dipped slightly. So it was 95% in 1960, and by 2005, it had dropped to 85%. So it was a slight drop, but by and large, still overwhelmingly intact families. Now, for the working class, again, in 1960, it was 95%, and by 2005, it had dropped to 30%. So
Yeah,
a
and we
completely
should
different
point
world,
something out
essentially.
there too, because there's an interesting progression between different ethnicities and races along that curve. So the first, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this to be the case, the first population that really affected was the Black population. Then it was the Hispanic population. Then it was the white population. But the curves match. They're just like 10 years apart. If you look at the same socioeconomic level. And so, yeah, that's a good example of policies that are hypothetically liberal at the high end having a devastating effect farther down. And,
Right.
these people who claim that marriage, for example, is a patriarchal institution. Well, the best rejoinder to that I know of is then, well, why do the rich get married and the poor don't? Are they choosing to oppress themselves given their options? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, I think it's an absolutely foolish theory to begin with, but that seems to me to be a piece of data that indicates quite clearly that if you have a choice, that's what you pick. Or if you have the widest possible level of choices, that's what you choose. And so, yeah, it's a catastrophe. Although, the fact that it's a catastrophe is also hidden by a whole other set of luxury beliefs, like all families are of equal value, which in some sense is true, right? Because if you're thinking about how each person should be valued and whether or not the child of a single mother should be valued, well, obviously the answer to that is yes, but that doesn't mean that all family configurations are equally functional on average. And I think the data is absolutely clear that children with intact two-parent families do far better. Now, if you get divorced, there are things you can do that moderate the effect of the divorce. What's his name? He wrote The Boy Crisis. Warren Farrell has documented a number of ways that people who get divorced can ensure that their children do about as well as they would in an intact family. And some of that involves approximately 50% contact with each parent. I think the parents also need to attend counseling, third-party counseling, so that they can maintain a reasonable relationship, and they have to live within something approximating a 20-minute drive from one another, something like that. But I mean, that takes a lot of balancing and dancing to replicate that environment. And it seems impossible in our society to have a discussion about the fact that some forms of families are better for children than others. And because we think of any imposition of a value analysis of that sort as discriminatory. And, you know, in some sense it is discriminatory, because when you say that one thing is better, you're also saying at the same time that the opposite of that is worse. Well, then it depends on who you're trying to focus on. And well, I go by the data fundamentally. And, you know, children born to young single mothers, especially if the young single mothers are troubled and therefore also easy targets for predatory males, they don't do well. And there's multi-generational effects of that. And we're too bloody naive and I don't know, immature, I guess, to have a serious conversation about such things. And we also don't know how to put the genie back in the bottle. But there's no tax break, for example, for stable married couples. So there's no economic policy that supports it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure that would even change much. I mean, I think this is much more of a cultural issue than an economic issue. I mean, you know, a lot of people say, well, it's kind of interesting how many different excuses are produced for this. I mean, like you said, a lot of people say that it's this patriarchal institution, but then why are the rich getting married more than the poor?
Well, I don't even
and
know
then
what
a lot
that
of people
means.
will say,
Let's talk about that for a minute. I mean,
sure.
I suppose that claim is grounded in the historical interpretation that in the past, women were